Okay, so I'm going to turn over to one of our PhD students, Zoe Haskell-Craig, who will introduce our speaker today. So welcome everyone to our Biostatistics Department monthly seminar series. Okay, Zoe.
Hi, everyone. So today's speaker will be Dr. Datta. Dr. Datta is an assistant professor in the Biostatistics Department at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. His current research focuses on hierarchical models, Bayesian machine learning, and shrinkage methods with applications in small area estimation, which we'll hear about today. However, he also works on a wide range of topics in spatial statistics, and he's recently published papers on spatial modeling for cancers, on calibrating low-cost PM 2.5 monitoring networks, and on spatial disease mapping using directed acyclic graph autoregressive models. Dr. Datta did his undergraduate studies at the Indian Statistical Institute, and he completed his PhD in 2016 at the University of Minnesota. So we're really excited to have him here today and hear about his work on population size estimation techniques. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Zoe, and thank you, Rebecca, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be visiting the department. Can everyone hear me and see my slides? And the cursor,
yes.
is the cursor visible? Okay, great.
Yes.
So I'm going to be talking about a method for estimating population sizes of hidden populations in particular using multi-source data sets. This is called the multiplier method. I didn't know about this method until I started working on this project. It's similar to the capture recapture, in fact, exactly similar when there are two sources, but things differ for the multi-source setting, which would be the focus of this talk. So this is a summary of the collaborators and funding for this work. This is a joint work with several people. Most notable, I would say, is Stefan Baral. So Stefan is a professor in the Department of Epidemiology at Hopkins, and so Amrita is a student at the Epi department working with Stefan, and Andrew Peter was my master's thesis advisee, who sort of led a lot of the data analysis done in the project. And Becky and Zandile were our partners in Africa, providing help with the data set and sort of consulting with the methods and interpretation of the results. And this work was funded by the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, and the USAID. Okay, so just an outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll review some of the methods for population size estimation using multi-source data. In particular, I'll talk about the capture recapture, which is a very established and familiar method to many people. And I'll talk about extensions of cap recap for multiple data sources. And then I'll introduce the multiplier method, which is often used in the context of some hidden or stigmatized populations. In particular, I'll be focusing on the exam motivating data application from Eswatini, a country which was formerly known as Swaziland. And we'll talk about the different HIV key populations in that country and what are the different data sources and the issues with standard use of the multiplier method for the data. In particular, there is incompleteness and misalignment in the data that needs to be taken care of when generating population size estimates. And we'll propose a Bayesian multiplier method to sort of address all these issues. We'll discuss the implementation of the method and different extensions, and we'll apply it to get estimates of key populations in Eswatini and evaluate the method using simulation studies. And we'll also talk about an extension to relax some of the assumptions that goes into many of these methods. And I'll end the talk with a brief summary of the findings. So I'll start with a brief review of the capture recapture method. So suppose we want to estimate the size of an unknown population, and this is the population that we want to estimate. It consists of 20 individuals. We don't know that size 20 yet. So this is what we are interested in estimating. So what capture recapture does is that it initially does one survey, And suppose that survey marks or tags n1 number of individuals. So in this toy example, say n1 is 9. And then it later, at a later time point, conducts a second independent survey and tags a second set of individuals. So in this case, say the second survey tagged n2 number or 10 individuals. And in the second survey, they check whether the individuals that are being captured or tagged in the second survey were also tagged in the first survey. So here we have individuals that were in the first survey, but not in the second survey, who were just in the second survey in neither of the surveys and in both the surveys. So we have all this type of recapture history of the individuals. The quantity of interest for estimating the population size is the number of individuals captured marginally in each survey, which is N1 and N2, and then the number of individuals in the overlap of the two surveys, which is in this case, these are the individuals which have both the red tick and the blue tick. So there are 5 such individuals, and we denote this overlap as N12. So using this data, there is a very famous estimator called the Lincoln-Peterson estimator. It came about in sort of studies of estimating animal populations in 2 classic papers, one from the I think this is 1896, and one from 1930. And it basically relies on the assumption that the 2 surveys are independent and the inclusion probabilities of every individual in a survey are IID. They can vary across the surveys, but within a survey, the inclusion probabilities are the same for all individuals. And using those assumptions, you can say that the proportion of all individuals in the population who were tagged in the first survey is same as the proportion of individuals in the second survey who were tagged in the first survey. So because the 2 surveys are independent, this identity is going to hold. So the proportion of all individuals who were tagged in the first survey is N1 over N. And of course, we don't know N. This is what we want to estimate. And then the proportion of individuals in the second survey who were tagged in the first survey is simply the overlap count N12 over the marginal count for the second survey N2. Okay. So under the assumption this identity holds, and this leads to the Lincoln-Peterson estimator of the population size, which is n hat given by n1 times n2 over n12. Okay, so going back to our toy example, here you have n1, n2, and n12. So you can calculate the Lincoln-Peterson estimate, which in this case is going to be 18, and the true population size is 20. So you can see if the sizes of the population is large enough, you would see desirable properties of this estimator. Okay. So there is a model-based version of Recapture, and I'll introduce it because it is required in the method that we develop, and also it sort of makes the Recapture methodology more flexible. So what the model-based version does is that it relies on the same assumption as the original method, but then it sort of derives a model under which we'll get the estimate of the population size. So if we denote PI as the inclusion probability of an individual in the ith survey, so there are 2 surveys, so there are 2 of these quantities, P1 and P2, and then we can view the counts that we have as partial realizations from a multinomial distribution. So in particular, if there are total uppercase n many individuals, and these are the inclusion probabilities P1 and P2, then N12 are the count of individuals who are included in both surveys. And since the surveys are independent, the inclusion probability of being included in both surveys is simply P1 times P2. Similarly, N1 minus N12 is the count of individuals who are included in the first survey, but not included in the second survey. And the inclusion probability for those individuals are going to be P1 times 1 minus P2. And you do the same thing for N2 minus N12. And the last part is the ones that are included in neither survey. This is an unknown quantity for us. So we denote this as N minus R, where R is the total number of individuals who were tagged in at least one of the surveys. So that is the sum of the marginal counts of each of the surveys minus the overlap, because it's been counted twice here. Okay, so these are the four atomic partitions of the population based on their inclusion history. So with two data sources, you have four such partitions, and they can be thought of as realizations of a multinomial distribution, with these being the respective partition probabilities. And so you have like a likelihood for your unknown parameters n, p1, and p2. And this paper in 1958 and 59, I think there were two papers. This is number 2, and there was also number 1. I missed that citation here. It showed that the maximum likelihood estimate from this model coincides with the Lincoln-Peterson estimator. Okay. So there are several advantages of this model-based formulation. And the first among those is that you can easily extend this to more than 2 surveys. So you have the likelihood for 2 surveys, which turns out to be this. You have the part coming from survey 1, and you have the part coming from survey 2, and you have this term outside. If we have, say, S many surveys where S can be greater than 2, then writing down the likelihood requires a little bit of notation, but I'll try to keep the notation at minimum, but we'll need a sum of some notation. So we denote by n subscript AB the number of individuals who are tagged in surveys that are indexed by the set A and not tagged in surveys that are indexed by the set B. So this denote the finest partitions of the population in terms of their inclusion probabilities. So if R denotes the total number of individuals tagged in at least one of the S surveys, then you can show that multinomial likelihood for S surveys, which will have 2 to the power S many partitions. So in the previous one, it had 4 or 2 square many partitions. For S surveys, it will have 2 to the power S many partitions. So that multinomial likelihood can be simplified to this nice form. And the advantage of this form is that you don't need this individual inclusion count or partition counts, NAB. All you need is the sufficient statistics, which is R, which is the total number of individuals tagged in at least one of the surveys, and then the marginal counts for each of the surveys, which are N1 up to NS. As I said, we do not need the counts for the finest partitions based on the inclusion history, because there will be 2 to the power S minus 1 such partition. So as long as we know these are not required. Okay. The advantage of the likelihood-based method is also that we can do a Bayesian estimation, and we can adopt a Bayesian estimation strategy. So as I said from the previous slide, this is the likelihood when we have S surveys. And then in the literature, people have proposed using priors for the unknown population size N and for the unknown inclusion probabilities PI. So there's this Castellan paper and this paper by Ed George and Christian Robert in 1992. They've shown that this prior, where the probability of n is proportional to 1 over n. It's an improper prior, but this is the Jeffreys prior. And then for inclusion probabilities, people typically use the beta prior because they give nice conjugate updates in the Gibbs Sampler. So with this choice of priors, you get conjugate updates, not only for the Gibbs Sampler, not only for the inclusion probabilities, but also for the population size, which becomes a negative binomial, which is negative binomial distributed. And you can play around with different choices of priors. You can also use a Poisson prior. It has been also used in the past, in which case these Gibbs updates also become Poisson, so they still remain conjugate. When the population of interest is a subpopulation of a greater population and with known size, P, then this paper by Leubau and Adrian Raftery in 2015, they proposed using a binomial prior for N. So N is a because it's a subpopulation of a greater population. So you have n follows binomial p5, where phi gives the proportion of this greater population which belongs to this subpopulation. So you can also infer about this proportion if you're using such a model. Okay, so now we come to our setting, which is the multiplier method and key populations. So in HIV epidemics, some populations like men who have sex with men, or MSM, female sex workers like who are abbreviated as FSW, and person who injects drugs, or PWID, they are key populations in HIV epidemics, as they are at heightened risk and burden of HIV. And these populations also often face a lot of stigma, discrimination, and criminalization due to their sexual orientations and sex work as profession. And so it's very hard to collect data on these populations. Conducting multiple surveys, which is a requirement for the Recapture method, is often not feasible due to budgetary constraints, and also due to the stigma associated in these settings. So the standard Recapture is often replaced by a variant called the multiplier method. So in the multiplier method, the first survey, or the capture part, is not conducted, and it's replaced by a listing or count of the key population members involved in an activity or using a service. So for example, you can get a count of the key population members attending a special event for that specific community. For example, for men who have sex with men, there is often a rainbow night that people attend, and you get the number of MSM who attended the rainbow night from the event registers. Similarly, there are often nonprofit organizations trying to offer services to these communities, and from their service registers, you can also get counts of these populations. You can also get counts from like their visits to a medical clinic and so on. There are various different options to get a count of these key population members. And then there's a single survey conducted, in which case, in that survey, the members are asked about their involvement in the first activity. So if it was a rainbow night, when the second survey is conducted, the members are asked if they participated in the rainbow night. So from that, you get both the N2, which is the number of members participating in the survey, but also N12, which is the number of members in the survey who also attended Rainbow Night. And of course, from the log of the Rainbow Night register, you can also get the total number of members who attended the Rainbow Night. So it's exactly similar to the Recapture for two sources. The only difference is there is no first survey. It's replaced by a listing or a count of the members from some activity or service. And the multiplier method estimate is also exactly the same as the Lincoln-Peterson estimate. It's simply the N1 times N2 over N12. Okay, so now we come to our motivating data application, which is estimating key population sizes in the country of Eswatini. Eswatini is a landlocked country in Southern Africa. It has been highly impacted by the HIV epidemic, the high proportion of adults living with HIV. And so it's important to get data on these key populations to understand their risk and allocate program resources accordingly. So we have data, and there is not much data on these key populations because of the aforementioned stigmatization. So we had data on men having sex with men and female sex workers at 5 sites in Eswatini. So this is a map of Eswatini. Each color represents a different region. So there are 4 regions in the country, and we had data from 5 sites in the country. As you can see, these 2 belongs to the Hoho region. Manzini belongs to Manzini region. This bottom 2 belongs to the Sishelvani region. And I've marked this gray rectangle here because these 2 are bigger like urban areas, Manzini and Babane, and they are often referred together as the corridor. And this is important because it sort of dictates some of the data features that I'll be talking about later. And then within each region, there are a lot of smaller administrative divisions, and these are called the tinkundlas. So as you can see, each region is subdivided into many tinkundlas. This is a summary of the data that we had. This is based on the survey that was conducted at the end. So on MSM, we had data on around 532 survey participants. Only 4 of them came from the district of Lubombo, so we had to exclude them. Similarly, only one came from the district of Shishilvani, so we excluded them as well. For female sex workers, we had around 780 survey participants. Only 7 of them came from the region of Lubombo, so we had to exclude them as well. The goals of the project was to generate uncertainty-quantified estimates of MSM and FSW population size at each of the 3 regions for which we have data, because as you can see in the previous map, there is no data from the Lubombo region, so we only had data from these 3 regions. Then another goal was to extrapolate size estimates to the Lubombo region, and then to downscale estimates from the regional to the Tinkundla level. So we had various types of sources for the multiplier method available in the Eswatini data. So there was this unique object identifier, which are unique objects. In this case, it was like a deck of cards that were distributed to the key population members for a certain period before the survey. And then in the survey, they were asked whether they had received such a card or not. Similarly, there were HIV service coupons that were distributed. Rainbow Night, I mentioned, it's a social event for MSM. So the total number of MSM attending the Rainbow Night was available. And then in the survey, they were asked whether they attended the Rainbow Night or not. Similarly, FLAS was an NGO offering services geared towards sexual health and HIV prevention for a number of female sex workers who attended the FLAS. One of the FLAS health clinics was also available. And in the survey, they were asked whether they attended the health clinic or not. And not all sites had data on all the multiplier sources. So the number of data sources available was very site specific and also specific to MSM or FSW. Okay, so let's look at some of the data that were available. So we'll first start with the simplest case. So these are the FSW data for the sites of Pikes Peak, Lavumisa, and Langano. So here you see that, of course, the survey counts are available for each of these sites. And then we have data on the unique ID or UID. And because in the survey, we asked them whether they received the unique object or not, we also have data on the overlap. And similarly for MSM, at the Pikes Peak side, we have data which has the exactly same structure. This is the standard multiplier method setting. So for all these sites, we can obtain the population size estimates using the standard Lincoln-Peterson estimator. Okay, so now we come to the more challenging part of the data set. So we look at the MSM data for the Langano site, and there were 3 sources. 2 of them were for the multiplier listing, and 1 was, of course, the survey. So we had a total of 70 survey participants, 12 Rainbow Night attendees, and 106 UID, 106 members who received unique objects. Of course, as we are asking them questions about each of these activities in the survey, within the survey, we know the partition counts because we are asking about whether they attended the Rainbow Night, whether they received the unique object. So within the survey, within this part of the Venn diagram, we know all these partition counts because we had asked them questions. Outside of the survey, we don't know these numbers, these partition counts. All we know is that a total of 12 MSM attended Rainbow Night, 106 MSM received unique objects. We do not know these finer partition counts outside of the survey. And why this is problematic is that if we don't have knowledge about these, we cannot calculate R, which was the total number of individuals tagged in at least one of the 3 sources. So R is like the total size of this Venn diagram. And as you can see, with this information available, you cannot calculate that. You would need information on at least one of these three partitions to sort of fill up all of them based on the data available and then calculate R. So without that, you cannot calculate the Lincoln-Peterson estimator. Okay, so what typically is done is that people calculate pairwise multiplier method estimates. So we look at the paired data between the survey and the UID. So for that, we have the marginal counts of the survey, marginal counts of UID, and the count of the overlap, which is 43. And then we use a multiplier method estimate for these two data sources. And we do the same thing for these two, like survey and the rainbow night as well. So for each of the non-survey data sources, we can pair it with the survey and calculate the pairwise multiplier method estimate. And this is an intuitive method, but the issue is that each of these estimates are using the survey, which was a single survey. And so these pairwise estimates are correlated. And when we take the average of these pairwise estimates to get the estimate for the region, that averaging ignores this correlation and is going to be suboptimal. So this is a simulation study that I'm going to describe in details later. So just mimicking the data patterns in Langano, we have a multiplier method estimate based on the survey and the UID, a multiplier method estimate based on the survey and the rainbow night, and the average estimate, which is simply the average of these two estimates. So as you can see, we had more data on unique object recipients. So this estimate was highly precise. Whereas this estimate was not. And then the average was somewhere in the middle. So it's not as precise as this one. And we'll see that if we can account for this dependence among these estimators, because their use of the common survey, we can improve upon this estimate, which is currently often used in multi-source multiplier data settings. Okay, so what we proposed was a Bayesian multiplier method. So the methodology extends to more than three sources. So we present the method for the general case of S data sources, the Sth one being the survey, and the first S-1 being the other sources for the multiplier method. If we knew the counts of all the finest partitions of the Venn diagram, or if we knew R, which is the total number of members who were included in at least one of the S sources, then we could write down the complete data likelihood, which has this nice form just in terms of R and the marginal counts. And we could easily do inference on N. Of course, we cannot do that because we know all the partition counts within the survey, as we saw in the previous example. So we know all these 4 partition counts here, but we don't know the partition counts outside of the survey, and consequently, we don't know what R is. So the observed data likelihood is going to be a sum of this complete likelihood over all the possible values of these missing partition counts, and that sum is intractable, and that sort of complicates things. So this is the main idea in one slide, and it's extremely simple. The main idea is that we use the much nicer looking complete data likelihood instead of the intractable observed data likelihood. And to use this complete data likelihood, we'll simply impute the missing counts in a Bayesian framework. So we basically cast multi-source multiplier method data as an incomplete multiple capture recapture data where some of the counts are missing. And we will impute them, and then we can use the nice looking complete data likelihood. That's the main idea. Some of the complexities lies in implementation of this. We propose a general Gibbs sampler for imputing all the partition counts, and we allow for S sources which need not be just 3, and we also allow for arbitrary patterns of incompleteness. So I'll give a visual visual explanation of the Gibbs sampler. For S sources, it becomes very notation heavy. So I've tried to avoid that. And we'll just give an example using 3 sources. So here we have 3 sources. We do not know these fine partition counts that we want to impute. So we first considered the situation where even these fine partition counts were unknown. So this is an even worse problem to sort of tackle. In the multiplier method setting, these x1 up to x4 will be known. But for now, just consider the situation where these are unknown. And of course, these are unknown as well. If we find all of these, then we can calculate the last one. So that's why I do not sort of use any notation for that. So this setting where all of the fine partition counts are unknown can be viewed as a contingency table, S-way contingency table, or 2 to the power S contingency table, where you have the known marginals and you want to sample a random draw of that contingency table. Because you have the known marginals, but all the fine partition counts are unknown. And there is a lot of literature which have done that, and which is why we kind of went back and sort of tried to see what are the solutions for this kind of harder problem. And so there is a very classic work on Markov bases by Diaconis, who sort of proposed a random walk on the space of contingency tables, and Markov bases are small movements you can make in that space, sort of to explore the space in a metropolis setting. And there has been work by Adrian Dobra on local Markov bases. These are very sophisticated work, but it also involves carefully choosing the Markov bases or proposal distributions for the contingency tables. A solution with Gibbs sampling kind of avoids that. And so there have been other solutions using Gibbs sampling, especially this Smith et al. Paper. This solution is only for 2-way contingency tables, and we are working with a multi-source or a S-way contingency table. So we'll propose a Gibbs sampler. We'll first propose a Gibbs sampler for sampling realizations of S-way contingency tables with known marginals, and then modify that sampler for our multiplier method setting. Okay, so this is the outline. So what we'll do is that here we need to sample the x's and the y's. And of course, after that, we need to sample the n and the inclusion probabilities p. We reparameterize. So we write down z1 as x1 plus y1, which is this partition marked by the blue line. I don't know if the blue is visible. And similarly, we define z2 as x2 plus y2, which is marked by this red outline. So in our Gibbs sampler, we update 4 blocks of parameters. First are the x's, conditional on everything else. Then are the z's, conditional on everything else, and finally we do for the n and the p's. Okay. So first look at the x's. So here in a Gibbs sampler, we do conditional updating. So when we are sampling the x's, we know z, n, and p. Okay. So when we want to sample the x's, we know that the x's need to sum up to 70 because the marginal is fixed. We also know that x1 can only come from this green shaded area, which is z1, and z1 is known. Because x1 is the count of a subset of z1. So it can only come from this shaded area. Similarly, x2 can come from this pink shaded area. And similarly from x3 for x3 and x4. So conditional on z, n, and p, the draws of x1, x2, x3, x4 can be thought of as draws of 70 balls, 70 because the total is fixed, 70 balls from an urn containing balls of 4 colors. And the number of balls of each of the colors is given by the shaded areas. So it turns out, and this is just an illustration for 3, it works for S-way tables as well. So turns out this conditional distribution is simply a hypergeometric distribution. Draw of sample size 70 with this total ball counts, which are given by Z1, Z2, Z3, and Z4. And all of these are known when we know Z and N. Okay, so the next one is to draw Z conditional on X, N, and P. So to do that, we'll note that Z is written as, Z1 is written as X1 plus Y1. So if X is known, X1 is known. So essentially we need to sample Y1 and Y2. Okay, so again, the sum Y1 plus Y2 is known because this circle is known, which is 106, and X1 and X2 are known because we are conditioning on them. So the sum of Y1 plus Y1 plus Y2 is known. It's 106 minus X1 plus X2. Okay, and we are drawing those many balls. Y1 can only come from the green shaded area. Y2 can only come from the orange shaded area. And so this again follows a hypergeometric distribution, and you can do the conditional update of Y1, Y2 given Xn and P, and hence the conditional update of Z given Xn and P. Okay, so this is a summary. So we have hypergeometric updates for both X and Z, and this generalizes to S sources of data. I have skipped that part because it's very heavy on the notation. And then once at each iteration, once you update X and Z, the updates of N and P are same as the Bayesian version of capture recapture. It's simply beta updates for the PIs and the negative binomial updates for the N. If you're using a Jeffreys prior, if you're using other priors, this update will change accordingly. For the multiplier method, so this was a Gibbs sampler for generating draws of a contingency table with known marginals. For the multiplier method, the X is unknown because these are the partitions within the survey. So all we need to do is to generate the other counts. So we'll skip the X update part. All the other updates stay the same, and we have a Gibbs sampler for the Bayesian multiplier method. Okay, so that sort of addresses the multi-source multiplier method using a Bayesian version that naturally accommodates the dependence because it doesn't count the survey twice. It's utilizing the structure of the data to create the model, and then we are using Gibbs sampling to get the samples. The next problem we had in the Eswatini data was misalignment, and this is where the corridor comes in. The corridor consists of two sites, two urban sites, Babane and Manzini, and they belong to different regions. But often some data are collected as and reported as a single number for the corridor. And this is problematic because these two belongs to different regions, and we need region-specific numbers to have to sort of allocate resources for programs. So it's important to sort of disentangle the single number for corridor into separate numbers for Manzini and Babane. So to give an example, here's the MSM count for Babane and Manzini. So as you can see, we have the survey, we have everything known within the survey. Then we have the unique object ID, and we have a similar structure as we saw earlier. We know the marginals, but of course we don't know these. But then for the coupons that were distributed, we don't even know these marginals. All we know is that there were a total of 106 coupons distributed for the corridor region, which is both Babane and Manzini. So U plus V is 106. We know that, but we don't know what U is and what V is. And a similar thing happens when we look at the female sex workers data, also for Babane and Manzini. Here, the number of FSW who went to the FLAS clinic is unknown. All we know is that the total was 186, but there is also an additional constraint that we know that at least 70 of them went to the clinic in Babane. So we have the constraints that u plus v is 186 and v is greater than 69. So there are further constraints in the model that are caused due to the misalignment. There are additional unknowns as well as further constraints. So our solution is going to be effectively the same. We are going to impute, and then we are going to use the joint complete data likelihood. So suppose we had no spatial misalignment, we had the marginal counts for each region or each site, then our joint data likelihood is simply going to be product of the complete data likelihoods for each region. So, and then we can do like Bayesian inference on the population size estimate for each region. So here the superscript k denotes the region specific variables, but this is same as the likelihood that we saw earlier when we were just considering one region, just that we have product now over k regions. This is when we have no spatial misalignment. With spatial misalignment, the observed data likelihood, once again, is going to be sum over this joint likelihood over various choices of the u and the v variable. And that, again, is going to be intractable. And so we'll use the same trick that we want to use this nicer looking joint complete likelihood instead of the summed over like observed data likelihood, and we'll do imputation of the missing counts to keep using this. So to do the imputation for the misaligned multiplier data, we do the same thing that we did before, but just now we sort of use a superscript to say that this is region 1 and this is region 2. So we need to impute these numbers, but we also need to impute these marginal numbers because these are also unknown. So in the Gibbs Sampler, conditional on u and v, the updates within each region are the same as before. It's going to use the Bayesian, the hypergeometric updates that we showed for the incomplete case. So the only difference here is that we need to have an additional update where we sample from the u's and the v's conditional on everything else. So I write down the u and v as a vector w. So the only new step is the need for full conditionals of w. So to do that, we have the total u plus v equals to 106. And when everything else is known except for w, we have the totals for these slices of the Venn diagram. And so we can subtract those from 106, and we know what these two unknown cell counts sum up to. So it sums up to some m. I have not written down the explicit formula, but this m is basically 106, and then you subtract this slice, which is 8 plus 16 plus y11, and then you subtract this slice, which is 8 plus 21 plus y12. So when we are doing conditional updates in the Gibbs sampler, these slices are known. So this m is known. So this is equivalent to sampling m balls from an urn containing balls of 2 colors. But now these are in different regions with different inclusion probabilities. So this can be viewed of as biased urn. So in the urn, not only that you have balls of 2 different colors, but you also have different odds of picking a red ball versus a black ball. And turns out that this is called a non-central or Fisher's non-central hypergeometric distribution. And the full conditional comes out neatly to be a draw from this Fisher's non-central distribution, with the odds being the odds generated by the inclusion probabilities for this source, which is in our case the coupon for MSM for these 2 regions, Manzini and Babane. And this again extends to S sources with arbitrary patterns of misalignment, in which case we have to replace this with a non-central multivariate hypergeometric distribution. Okay, so then this is the model, final model for the analysis. This is the joint complete data likelihood. We have this L is the total number of regions. So it's a product of the region specific likelihoods. And within each likelihood, we have the contribution for each of the data sources. The data sources DS can be specific to the asset region. We have inclusion probabilities, which are given beta priors. We give the a binomial prior for the population size estimates because they are a subpopulation of the larger male or female populations, which are known. And we have a beta prior for the proportion of male or female populations that are MSM or FSW. And of course, we use separate models for MSM and FSW. So these are the site-specific estimates. I'm not going to go over these too much, but as you can see, the proportion of the male population that are MSM percentage, that are MSM, varies from around 3% to like 4.5%. And the inclusion probability goes from around 8% to as high as 60%, depending on the source and the region. Similar thing for the FSW. I'm not going to go into these results in details. To go from the site level estimates to the Tinkhundla level estimates, for Manzini, we have only one site. So we assume that each Tinkhundla within Manzini has that same proportion that we calculate for the site of Manzini. For Hoho, we have two sites. So we use a spatially weighted average of the proportions we obtain at these two sites when we calculate the proportion for each of the Tinkhundlas. And we do the same thing for Seychelles as well. And then to extrapolate to Lubombo, we simply use the mean of the proportion distribution, the posterior mean of the proportion distribution. Then we aggregate these. Once we have it at Tinkhundla level, we just sum it up to get the regional level estimates. So these are the regional level estimates. And there is very little data before this analysis on what these numbers can look like. So it's good to have some estimates and some uncertainty quantification of these estimates, and also the estimates of the proportion. But of course, there is no way to verify how good this model is because we don't know what the truth is. There's absolutely no data to do that. So we look at some of the assumptions that went in and that can possibly affect these estimates. So first of all, there was an age extrapolation assumption that the surveys were mostly between 18 to 30 years for MSM and 18 to 35 years for FSW. And we extrapolated to general population for which is 15 to 49 years. This is reasonable for females for MSM because sexual orientation is generally is more robust to different age strata. But female sex workers, it can potentially vary, but we have no other data to sort of have an age-specific curve for these proportions. So we assumed it to be flat, and there is some literature which have said that it doesn't vary too much, but we don't know how accurate this assumption is, especially for FSW. Then going from the site level to the Tinkhundla level, we assume that the Tinkhundlas have the same proportion as that of the site within that region, or like a spatially weighted average if there were multiple sites within the region. And this again, if there is a lot of variation within the Tinkhundlas, this is going to be inappropriate. We assume the closed population, that means that there is no immigration. We did some sensitivity analysis to see how immigration can affect the results. Turns out it has a lesser impact, at least under a simple immigration model. The impact of immigration is kind of lessened by the inclusion probability. Unless both the inclusion probability is large and there's a large population immigrating, this may not be this may not distort the estimates too much. And then we had an assumption on independence of data sources, and to relax them, to verify that, we used posterior predictive p-values to do a goodness of fit tests, and all the p-values came out to be non-significant, which was good, saying that this was a reasonable assumption for this data set. These are the simulation results. I'll skip that in the interest of time, but overall, because we could not verify our method on real data, we generated fake data using the estimates from the real data analysis and the missingness and misalignment patterns. Overall, it does very well, as you can see, between the truth and the estimate column, and the coverage probabilities were also close to 95%. We compared with the average pairwise multiplier method. So this is the slide I had shown earlier. This is our method, which is the Bayesian method. As you can see, it performs at par with the multiplier method, with the most informative source, unlike the average estimator, which kind of suffers because it doesn't take into account the dependence. So in terms of all the matrix that we used, our method was uniformly much better than the average multiplier method. And then we had a relaxing of, we relaxed the independence and the homogeneity assumption by using a finite mixture model with latent clusters using Dirichlet process. So this is based on this Manrique-Valliere paper from 2016. So we assume that the population has many latent clusters, and independence and homogeneity only holds within each cluster. So when you marginalize over the clusters, they no longer hold. So under this assumption, we can extend our Gibbs sampler to this setting. I will not go over these steps, but I'll just show the results. So when the data is generated using independence, both the independent model and the Dirichlet process-based model perform similarly. But when the data is generated with dependence, the Dirichlet process model far outperforms the independent model, as you can see in the RMSE numbers. This is a summary. I'll skip that. I think I've gone over all these points over the course of the talk. And this is the paper which came out in Also Applied Statistics last year. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'll ask a question. So I'm just wondering if your comparison to the average pairwise methods, multiplier methods, are fair in that, are they taking into account, I couldn't tell, are they taking into account the constraints that you know, like, yeah, so if you look at, so for example, the middle question mark that you have in that lower overlap area, yeah. So you know that that can't be any bigger than 6. So is your pairwise estimator for the green and the blue taking into account that constraint on that middle overlap?
No, it does not. It just uses the marginal counts and this overlap and then this marginal count. So I'm not saying it's a very sophisticated method, but that's what people use. And we wanted to show that it's not using all the information that's out there. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. It's a very strawman method, but that is currently being used. And that's why it sort of leads to imprecise estimates.
So I wonder, I mean, is there an easy fix to just that simple crude method that, like, if it did take into account that constraint, would it be much better? I mean, I guess the answer probably is maybe in some cases, yes, like this, where there's a very big imbalance between the 12 and the 106, maybe not in other cases.
Yeah, probably, but I would then say that sort of what we are doing is kind of imputing these, and in that imputation, that constraint is being kind of respected. So that is kind of one of the way. We can of course not do the Gibbs sampler and do it in any other, impute it in any other way that respects the constraints. That would be fine too. But yeah, we would need to use all the information to get better estimates.
Right, I was just thinking in terms of like a bound, rather not an imputation, but just an upper bound or something. Yeah.
Yeah, there might be. I haven't thought of what would be a good estimator.
Okay, thank you. So have you done anything with your method to take it into sort of a structured correlated setting, like such that arises from respondent-driven sampling?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I had sort of brushed it up and put it under the carpet. You just lifted the carpet. So the data was collected using like a snowball sampling, which is not exactly the respondent-driven sampling, but it's still like a sampling on a network. And so that sampling framework was not used in getting these estimates. So we just use the Lincoln-Peterson estimator, which of course doesn't sort of consider that sampling framework. I recall seeing some work on the RDS method, like generating Bayesian version of RDS by, I forgot her name, Catherine, I forgot her last name. She's at University of Oregon. So I recall seeing some work. So she has done like a model-based version of RDS. And so I think some of those ideas can be used here. I'm not sure the original, like the hackathon estimator for RDS, I don't know how to do that for this setting, but the model-based version probably has the potential to be used in this setting.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much for an excellent talk, and we hope to see you in person in New York in the future. And thank you again. I think we all learned quite a lot. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the invitation again and for the thoughtful questions.